as we get closer to treatments, we see how important it is to involve all stakeholders to be part of this process. And this afternoon is an opportunity to hear from our funded investigators about how their research may impact patients' lives. We also will learn about treatments for celiac disease and the difficulty to maintain a gluten-free diet. During the breaks, we'll share a link to additional resources related to today's topics if you want to explore more. I would like to thank CHOP for hosting us, and to today's sponsors, Takeda Pharmaceuticals, Sanofi, and Teva Pharmaceuticals. So I'm going to turn it over to Kate Avery, one of the people on my team, to introduce this session.
Great. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. I'm Kate Avery. I'm the Senior Director of Coalition and Patient Engagement at Beyond Celiac. I've been at Beyond Celiac for 7 years now, and we've been really excited to watch the drug development pipeline expand over that time, see more and more companies get interested in celiac disease treatment, something we know that patients desperately want. So we're here today with Jocelyn Silvester, who's a pediatric gastroenterologist at Boston Children's Hospital. Jocelyn's going to talk to us about celiac disease drug development and what clinical trials in celiac disease look like and why. And then we're also joined by Beyond Celiac Ambassador Isabella Cardona, who is coincidentally also from Boston. Isabella participated in a celiac disease clinical trial, and she is here to talk to us about her experience. So, Jocelyn, I'll let you kick it off.
Thank you, and thank you very much for bringing us all together today. It's always wonderful to hang out and talk science with our celiac friends from around the world, and it's a really important part of moving the field forward. So I appreciate you investing in this so that we can keep the ball rolling. So, and I can't tell which slide. There we go. So first off, some disclosures, which is good news. It means that there's investment in celiac disease. And I wanted to take this a little bit back and sort of tie together some of the things we talked about in the morning and also look forward. So thinking about drugs and treatments for celiac disease, I think the first thing we always think about is what's new, but I think there's a few things before that we sometimes overlook that are probably still useful and important. So as a physician, really my goal is to make my patients feel better. And when I see my patients, the first thing I do is take a history and ask them about their symptoms. And only knowing symptoms, we have treatments for symptoms. We can palliate symptoms. And this is something we've historically done a poor job of in celiac disease, because I think there's been an attitude that, well, you're supposed to avoid gluten, you know you're supposed to avoid gluten, you ate gluten, that's your fault, you should suffer, which is not true. So come to my clinic, I will prescribe these medications for you if these are the symptoms you get when you have gluten, because gluten is going to find you despite your best efforts, and we have to accept that. And this is part of the reason why we are moving towards having better treatments, is we recognize that the gluten-free diet is not the treatment for celiac disease, it's a treatment for celiac disease, and currently the one that we use most often. So what about thinking about what a treatment for celiac disease would look like? So we also have treatments that treat the damage from disease, and these can also be non-specific. We know celiac disease is an inflammatory disease, so you could use anti-inflammatories for celiac disease. And in medicine, arguably the surgeons are the ones who are best at curing disease, because some problems you can just cut them out and they go away. But that's not going to work in celiac disease, because the immune system, as we've seen from sequencing all of these cells in every place we look, is everywhere. And so we need to find something that's going to work everywhere. Are we one slide behind? And so when we think about celiac disease, these are some of the specific treatments that we use in celiac disease and dermatitis herpetiformis in order to try and look at the consequences of celiac disease, but not necessarily treat the disease itself. And that's really, I think, when we think about treatments and drugs, really the goal is not treatments to make symptoms a little bit better, it's cures. And we don't actually have many of these in medicine, which is why there's big font on this slide, because this is really 21st and 22nd century medicine, and we're lucky in celiac disease that we're able to lead the way. So taking a step back, why a drug for celiac disease? And I think this audience knows, if we think about the glutenometer as how much gluten somebody can eat, we have where most people on a gluten-free diet are is with some gluten, not a lot of gluten, but we all have skeletons in our gluten-free cookie jar. And we could do a Cindy Haas-style banana diet, doesn't get cross-contact with gluten, you open it, you eat it fresh, but that's not really realistic. And so we have to accept there's some degree of contamination in a gluten-free diet. And then there's the other end of the spectrum, which is I eat croissants, I eat pizza, I eat Cheez-Its, I eat all of those things that people come to clinic and tell me they dream of. And these are two different applications and almost two different pipelines in terms of how we get there. So I think about the drugs in two ways. One is let's make a drug for people who are on a gluten-free diet to make the diet better. So can we treat the diet and get that gluten-free diet closer to the banana diet? The other one is to allow a, quote, normal diet, and can we get people so that they can eat as much gluten as they want and be totally fine? And as we've heard, because of the immunological nature of the disease, these tend to be immune-targeting medications. So what are the targets in celiac disease? And this is a cartoon because parts of it are made up because, as you heard this morning, we don't really know how everything links together yet. So I'm not going to walk you through it and pretend that we know, but on the top you see the croissant because that's inside the intestine. That row of cells that looks like a snake, that's those epithelial cells. And in the lumen where those croissants are, they're getting eaten by those Pac-Mans and broken into those yellow glutens, and then it gets deamidated, and then those gluten fragments can be recognized, and we have the immune response, and we have the villus atrophy. And so any of those things can be targets for celiac disease. We can start in the lumen, and we can just try and decrease the toxicity of gluten. Really, a gluten-free diet is just decreasing dietary toxicity. You could keep the wheat, but take the gluten out of the wheat. You could eat the gluten, but bind it. You could have a glutenase, like a lactase. What are the things you can do in order to decrease the gluten toxicity? And then what can you do to try and decrease the immune response to gluten? And so these are sort of broad families of targets. And what's nice about this and what's important is that there's actually 5 yellow dots there because there's really more than 5 different ways the companies are trying to tackle this problem. And that's really important because we know that most drugs fail. And we know that if you're trying the same thing, it usually fails the second, the third, and the fourth time too. And so having different targets means we actually have more in the pipeline. So this is the current, I updated this morning because this is how quickly this field is evolving, celiac disease drug development pipeline. You may not be able to see everything, that's okay. The point is it barely fits on one slide, which is good news. These are trials that are active or recently completed and not yet reported. And you can also see that there's companies there that are names you recognize. And I want to draw your attention to one on the bottom, which is Calypso, which then was developed by Merck and now has been taken by Novartis. And this is what happens in mature drug development, is you have companies that buy companies and sell companies. And so this is progress, even if we don't have a drug yet. So thinking about these targets, I want to think about, well, what's the clinical trial? How do we design them? And what are the ways that we're going to test if these drugs really work? Because ultimately, that's what we want, is a treatment that works. So one of the treatments that's exciting is this idea of inhibiting TTG. We actually haven't talked about TTG much this meeting, but it's actually really important because it makes the gluten stick to that DQ2 and DQ8 better so that it's easier to initiate that immune response, whether it's everybody all at once or everybody in series. We really need that step first. And so we have a drug that inhibits TTG. How do we know if it works? Now, celiac disease is really unique as a drug development program because we don't have a drug right now, so we can't just switch people from their old drug to the new drug. And we have a gluten-free diet that mostly works, but not necessarily very well. And so we have a huge pool of patients who are treated or partially treated on a treatment, and we don't actually really know how much gluten-free diet they're taking because we don't really know how much gluten they're taking. And we're not really taking people who are untreated and treating them with the drug a lot of the time. So usually in a clinical trial, you take sick people and you do something called screening, which is when you just make sure, are these actually the people I want in the trial? Do they really have celiac disease? Do they have damage or not have damage, whatever I'm looking for? And then once you know that they qualify, you randomize them, which means you assign them to a drug or a treatment. And then you have some treatment period. And then you have an endpoint, which is the stop sign. And you measure that to determine, did the people in the drug group do better than the people in the placebo group? Now, this is great, but it's very hard to try and do something as an alternative to a gluten-free diet. So in celiac disease, we're not taking people who are untreated for the most part. We're taking adults on a gluten-free diet already and well-controlled, and we're actually trying to prevent relapse, which is a little bit different than treating disease. So this is the design for this TTG inhibitor known as Z1227 or TAC227. And so they took people with well-controlled celiac disease, kept them on a gluten-free diet, and randomized them to either the drug or placebo. And then they had to add some gluten, because if you want a drug and you want to see if you can have gluten with a drug, you have to give people gluten in a clinical trial. Because if there's no gluten in a clinical trial, and we know that gluten drives disease, we're not actually testing a drug if we don't have gluten. And so then at the end, we can compare the people who had a gluten-free diet plus drug plus gluten to the people who had a gluten-free diet plus placebo plus gluten. And that's what they did, and it was published in our local rag, the New England Journal of Medicine. They showed that there was improvement in villus atrophy on the left. So the placebo group, you can see their villi got shorter, which is why the blue line goes down. And they also were the most inflamed, which is why on the other side, the intraepithelial lymphocytes go up. Now, of course, life is complicated. So this is if you look at the average, which looks pretty. And this is if you look at everybody, which looks a little bit more messy, because that's how life really is. And so this is why we talked a lot about, biomarkers and how do we measure celiac disease, because we need something that's precise in order to see an important difference. So another important strategy is immune tolerance. We've talked a lot about how do you activate the immune system? And there's a lot of drugs that are targeting these different processes to see if they can intervene and stop the end effect, which is inflammation. And these are actually very interesting drugs, because most of them are being tested in celiac disease very early. So there's not a similar drug that's approved for another disease, because celiac disease, as we heard earlier, is a great test model, because we know gluten is there and we can control them, and we have those different phenotypes of patients that we can study. And so one of these medications is CAN 101, which is an infusion, which goes to the liver and presents the gluten in a way that the body thinks that's not so bad, rather than getting excited and getting angry and responding even worse the next time. And so for this clinical trial, the question was not what's happening to the mucosa. The question is, if this is targeting the immune system, can we check and see if the immune system is responding? And so they did the same thing. They took people who were doing well on a gluten-free diet, they continued their gluten-free diet, and they randomized them to drug or placebo, but they didn't give them gluten until the very end, because they could give gluten to see if the drug was working, and they didn't have to necessarily give them gluten for an extended period of time, because they were able to look at an immune readout looking at IL-2, which we talked about a little bit earlier, which is released by these gluten-specific T cells and is detectable after a single gluten ingestion. And so depending on the question in the trial, you can have different readouts, and you may need different amounts of gluten, or you may want multiple readouts and do different things at different times. And so these are basically two of the same sorts of tests, showing that the group that got placebo on the far left had more of a response, which is why the dark blue bars are higher, and that the treatment groups didn't respond as much, which is what we want to see, because we hope that the drug blocks immune activation. Now, what's really cool about this is that they also did the sort of pharmacokinetic study, because often we bring people in for a clinical trial, we give them a drug, and then we don't let them go. We make them stay because we want to get more blood, lots of blood in clinical trials, because there's lots of great things we can look at. And one is the concentration of the drug. And so the time frame for clearance of the drug is on the scale of hours, but it was days later that they were doing the gluten challenge. And so this is a sign that there's actually immune modification, and kind of a very interesting idea that we're actually doing things that are changing how we respond in the future and is not a sustained treatment. So this is the pipeline again. And this is maybe what's most important. So this is a map of United States sites for clinical trials that are currently recruiting for celiac disease. Now, there's a big red star there because clinical trials are a global business, and they don't get registered for every country, they get registered for every trial. And so you may see something like there's lots of yellow stars. I want to be in that trial. Well, that trial, unfortunately, is not recruiting here. So those sites are hopefully going to be recruiting, but not recruiting yet. But you can go to clinicaltrials.gov and you can find out what's recruiting and you can see if there's sites near you. And the reason I really wanted to show this is to show that this is going to be a national effort, an international effort, and we need volunteers, because if we don't have people who are going to come and take a drug or a placebo and eat gluten so that we can see what happens, we're not going to be able to show that there's a drug that people can take and eat gluten and be okay. So if you want to find out more, clinicaltrials.gov, ask your doctor, join a research registry. I will shamelessly advertise our own. And we do have some screening questions because we don't want to contact you about studies that involve eating gluten if you don't want to eat gluten. So to finish, before the big hook comes out, treatments can be for symptoms, they can be for damage, or they can be for the disease and hopefully curative. And so right now, the medications that we have that we're using for celiac disease aren't necessarily designed for celiac disease, and the drugs that are being developed are really more targeted and hopefully will allow people with celiac disease to have more gluten. The question is just how much gluten is that? But that is the next frontier.
Great. Thanks so much, Jocelyn. So now we'll have Isabella talk a little bit about her clinical trial experience, and then we'll have some moderated questions, but then there'll be time at the end for audience questions as well. So Isabella, could you tell us just a little bit about how you decided you wanted to be in a clinical trial, what the process was of signing up, and then what your participation experience was like?
Yeah, sure. First of all, again, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here and share my story. I'll start a little bit with my diagnosis and how that brought me to getting involved in a clinical trial. I'm originally from Spain, and so I was actually on holiday for the summer in Spain when I was about 14 years old, and was honestly just getting a regular checkup, but something about the things that I told my doctor as a 14-year-old made her test for celiac disease, and that's how I found out. I spent the summer getting diagnosed and all the things involved with that. Spain is a country that was very welcoming in terms of the associations that are involved, the community that they were able to provide. I actually was not living in Spain at the time. I was living in Asia, which is a completely different ballgame. And so when I went there, I had to learn how to live with celiac disease in a place where no one knew really what it was. And so that was especially challenging for me. I'm thankful that my family was able to support me along the way, and that was definitely helpful. But I would say I felt alone for the better part of that, and that was especially going into high school, which is a challenging time for anyone. Fast forward to moving to college, I moved to Boston, where I currently continue to live now. And that was, again, another big step in my life. I would say I handled it well, but celiac disease was something that I not necessarily was putting at the forefront of my life. There was a lot of between school, trying to fit in, make new friends, live in a completely new country. There was a lot of things going on. And so while I was dealing with it okay and my symptoms weren't changing, I look back at that time and think how I could have dealt with that a little bit differently. Then about halfway through college, the pandemic happened, and COVID obviously impacted everyone in many ways, but as someone living with an autoimmune disease, it definitely impacted me a lot stronger than I thought, and I think that was another wake-up call of I don't fully know what it is, the celiac disease that I have, and how complex it is. And so with that came, that rude awakening and realizing that, hey, I actually don't think I feel as good as I'm telling people I feel. Like there's all these things that I devalidate for multiple reasons. I'm a strong person who's here studying chemical engineering, and that's my focus, but there really was a lot more behind that. And so when it came time to it after graduating, I realized, what is it that I want to do? Where do my passions and interests lay? And I realized that opportunity that Spain had given me to get in touch with my community and I'd passed up on and I didn't have in Asia, I could take up on in Boston. And so that's really when Beyond Celiac stepped in and I was able to find a community with them. And very early on in my engagement with Beyond Celiac, I got immersed into the world of clinical trials and learning what that was and how I too could help make an impact with the community. And so, well, I'm sure you have a few questions on the details of the clinical trial, but maybe just quickly, the 3 things that really pushed me forward to joining. One was just within a year, Beyond Celiac and the community in Boston, but also nationally, internationally, had given me so much. I wanted to find a way to give back, right? Like, a lot of times we're told we're one person, but actually every person, every data point, everything that we can do counts. And so I wanted to contribute in that way. Second was I was interested personally in the science, and I was selfishly, interested in if there was an ability and a chance to make myself feel better and make my day-to-day better on a therapy or an option that wasn't commercially available yet, then I was willing to take that chance. And then I would say finally is the fact that, again, for a lot of time of me living with my celiac disease, I wasn't really honing into that as much, right? Like I was trying to put it in the back burner, and being on a clinical trial doesn't just mean that you're focused on like continuing life with celiac disease and being focused on the food that you're eating, but really being in tune with your body and tracking your symptoms. And for me, that was huge because that's where I really unreeled and realized that there is a lot more behind just the tummy aches, the bloating, the headaches that come, and what it means on a daily basis for someone living with celiac disease.
Thanks. So how did you find the trial?
Through Beyond Celiac. So I was actually at one of your events and mingling and talking about with everyone, and seeing the posters and the pamphlets is one thing, but really talking to the people behind it. I think one of the biggest, again, things with clinical trials is demystifying the process. A lot of us, myself, I happen to work as well in the biotech industry, so I was a little closer to the clinical trial recruitment and patient side of things, but really realizing that there's people on the other end of it. You're not going to be locked in a cellar and thrown around. Like it really is a welcoming community, and I think being able to meet the people behind the trial at an event in person and talk to them before even thinking about getting enrolled was a huge motivator.
Jocelyn, do you hear that from people who enroll in trials with you too? Just like what they thought of it beforehand? Because even when I think about clinical trials, I somehow imagine them all happening in this like very white, sterile, like they just happen in like your doctor's office. But I imagine it as being this like very different place that you go.
Yeah, and I think, there's some ways that it's similar to clinical care, but how it's different, I think, is really that we track our patients in clinical trials much better than we do in clinical practice. We're using standardized measures and we're using them frequently. And so pretty much every day we may be asking patients questions about how they feel because we want to track that, because how patients feel is how we're going to get a drug approved. And I think also one of the things people might expect is, I can eat gluten in the trial. That means I'm not going to be on a gluten-free diet. And I think that's one of the hard things to explain, is that scientifically we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, that is hard. So you signed up for the trial. So what were some of the things that you had to do as part of the trial?
So at the beginning of the trial, I did have to do an endoscopy because they wanted to measure before and after what the insides looked like. And I had to do a series of just blood tests to make sure I was also, in healthy condition and was able to complete the trial. I met with the different people from the clinical trial representatives, and they really explained to me everything that I would be undergoing, making sure I was comfortable and letting me know exactly like what my options were at every step of the way. So I felt very comfortable and happy with that. Then throughout the clinical trial, I went into the site every 2 weeks. And there they either did just a general checkup, like asking how I was. I would get the dose that was due for that time, and they would usually do a blood check too as well. And then that was every 2 weeks from about, I'm trying to count the months. It was from about September to February. And every day, in addition to that, I had this little phone that I kept with me. And before midnight, I felt like Cinderella because it would end at the day, and if not, I would lose it. Then I had to fill out essentially a list of questions of how I felt that day. And that really goes back to what I was saying earlier about being in tune with your body and something that I hadn't been doing before, and really had to think, okay, like, did I feel any of this? And they had a list of symptoms, and you could also have a place where you could share anything. In addition to when going in on site, they would also ask me in person how the past 2 weeks have been. And at the conclusion of the trial, I had a second endoscopy as well.
I was curious about that when Isabella said that, because I feel like we hear this from people too, that like they're fine until they think about the symptoms that they're having, and maybe they've kind of brushed stuff aside for a long time because that's just like what it is like to have celiac disease. Do you hear that from your patients as well, or from people in trials?
Definitely, and that's why we often have an important phase in the screening period or a run-in period where we may think people are good for the trial, but we actually really want to know how good their symptoms are, and so we will just be really closely tracking their symptoms to make sure that the symptoms that they think they have are the symptoms they actually have, when, as you say, sometimes when you think about it every day, you realize things that you may have discounted otherwise.
Yeah. Isabella, did you have to eat any gluten as part of your clinical trial?
No, my trial was a gluten challenge-free trial.
That's the unicorn, and the dream, I think. So did you pick that trial specifically for that, or was that something that you were like open to, but the trial, the Venn diagram of trials in your area that you qualified for happened to be one that didn't have a gluten challenge?
I was open to it. I definitely say that it helped me, go across it, say yes in the end, because when you think about going on a trial, there's always a risk that, I don't know, in the back of my mind, will I feel better or will I feel worse, right? And so I think, especially in the moment where I was in my life, it was definitely a reassurance that I didn't have to eat gluten at that time. I will say ever since joining that clinical trial and learning more about other clinical trials in the area, because it was, I think, at the time, maybe one of two that were enrolling at the time, I've gotten a much better understanding of what it means to go on a gluten challenge. And so I think I would still be open to that.
Jocelyn, what do you think are some of the maybe misconceptions about gluten challenges in clinical trials and how they've changed over time?
I think that's a great question, and gluten challenges are challenging, and are we really trying to challenge the patient, or are we trying to challenge the immune system, and do we need the same amount for both of those things? And so I think one of the benefits of having some of these more precise tools that we've learned about is that we can be more precise in looking at the effects of gluten, and so we can start to scale the amount of gluten we need to what the drug does or what we're trying to figure out. And so one thing that has started to come about is this idea of, well, maybe for some outcomes you could do a single dose gluten challenge. If you want to look at histology, then you probably need to give a lot of gluten, because we know you need a lot of gluten for people to relapse, which is why we talked earlier about, people who've already gone on a gluten-free diet. We tell them to eat gluten for 6 weeks and they say you're crazy, right? And stay on their gluten-free diet. And which is why it's amazing that we have people who do come forward and do volunteer for these things, and we cannot do it without you. So thank you. And then there's the approach of, well, what if we're trying to simulate the gluten that we know that people get, the difference between that banana diet and the actual gluten-free diet? that may not be gluten every day, and it may not be as much gluten. And so I think we're being thoughtful about when and how much gluten we use, and that will continue to evolve and continue to go down. I think the other important thing about gluten is that, unfortunately, for many scientific reasons, powders are often better than foods.
Yes, we heard a few years ago, at our 2019 Research Summit, we had a panel of people that participated in trials, and the gluten slurry got slammed hard. People want to eat pizza or soft pretzels or something like that, not take a gluten slurry. So yeah, it would be a lot more appealing if you could eat whatever you want for a gluten challenge.
Yeah, but a pizza or a pretzel is very complicated, and so measuring how your body responds to that is much more complicated than a slurry.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I think there was a study that came out of England, and people actually got to choose what they wanted. And before we knew it came out of England, the Beyond Celiac staff was speculating, and it turned out that a whole bunch of people had picked sandwiches, and we were all like, sandwiches? And then we looked at where the study was run, and we were like, oh, that's why it was not a U.S. study. We would expect most people in the U.S. to pick pizza or something along those lines. Pasta, maybe, I don't know. So what advice would you, Isabella, give to someone who's maybe sitting in this room thinking about whether or not they should join a clinical trial?
Come talk to me. I think there's a lot of information online, but I would say it wasn't everything that I read online at the end of the day that told me to, yes, I want to get involved. It was talking to the people in the trial and other people who had involved in clinical trials, both for celiac and others, just trying to hear from an actual human what it means to be like. And I'm really happy to talk to anyone in this room or anyone who you think might be interested, because I think it really does go a long way. So just like talking to human on this side, know that on the other side of it, like the site that I went into every 2 weeks, like I was besties with the people who I would see. Like I was seeing them pretty regularly, and you had to stay a little bit afterwards just to make like as like a 30-minute buffer before you're like allowed to leave or something. And we would just talk. Like I was talking about my travels, about my days, about what's coming up in my life, and so it really is a much more human experience than you realize, and I just want to make sure that everyone knows that.
That's good. I think that's important. What advice would you give, Jocelyn, to someone who's thinking about it?
I think your advice is perfect, which is just ask questions and find out. And if you are somebody who is part of a group where you get these invitations, and if you think you might be interested in the trial, just click the button and answer the questions, because there's so many steps between clicking the button and answering the questions and actually even coming to the site to find out if we can screen you for the clinical trial. So it's the beginning of a process of finding out, and you're really not committing. And so take your time, but also explore and see what's out there, because there's many different trials. And talk to investigators, come to meetings, talk to people who've been in trials.
Yeah. So Isabella, have you found out about the results, or like what you were on as part of the trial, whether you were on the drug or placebo?
I have not found out yet, but I was told I will. I think it's just a matter of them concluding the trial, collecting the data, and then sending them out. That is something I'm excited to see. I definitely have my suspicions on what side I was on, but I don't know for sure yet.
And Jocelyn, can you talk about, sometimes we have trials that have come out in celiac disease in the past that haven't met their endpoints, or maybe haven't been as successful as we thought they were going to be. I'm not saying that that's what's happening here. I have as much idea as Isabella does about this trial. But what does it mean, I guess, for drug development in general to have a trial that doesn't meet its endpoints or isn't successful? And then what does it mean to have a drug and a trial that is successful?
Good question. So that list I showed, I update regularly, and there's things that were on that list last year that aren't on that list now. And some of those things may come back, and some of those things may have, quote, failed. And when a trial fails, it's designed to meet a primary endpoint, and that's what people think they need in order to move the drug forward to be able to eventually show it's going to work. But in a trial, there's a lot more outcomes than the primary endpoint. There's that one primary endpoint, sometimes it's a co-primary endpoint, and then often there's pages of other things. That's why we're taking all the blood, we're asking all the questions, is because a well-designed trial is not just going to teach us about the drug, it's going to teach us about celiac disease. And what we learn about celiac disease in trials is going to improve how we do the next trial and how we design the next drug. And so it's a contribution, even if that's not the drug that makes it across the finish line, because remember, 90% of them will not.
And that's part of why drug development takes so long. I think we've been saying for a long time that we hope in 5 years there'd be a drug in it. It is hard. We haven't touched on this yet, but I know that this is a question that I get asked a lot, which is, what about clinical trials for adolescents or for children? Where is celiac disease drug development on that topic?
That's a great question. I am a pediatric gastroenterologist, and we're currently conducting a pediatric clinical trial because it's an intervention study, which means that we're giving children gluten and we're looking at the effects on the immune system because we need to know that children react the same way as adults so that we can test things in children the same way we test them in adults. And I think that's a really important point, is that there's lots of things we do before we even get to the drug. I think in practice, it's very common in drug development to start with adults. I think kids are more valuable, but I'm highly biased. You can also get more blood from adults, which is also helpful. And they're more able to consent, which is also very important. But I think it's a matter of time, and it's something that is important to communicate if there's interest and demand, because I think it's kind of a bit of a question of, well, how much do we need a drug in celiac disease? Are we going to have the people who are going to be able to do the trial, and what can we do in a trial? And I think as a community, we're trying to work these things out. And I think it's important to have these discussions, not just as the people who are doing the studies, but also as the people who will be participating in the trials, because it's going to be a group project to get something to the finish line.
Great. So I'm going to ask both of them one last question, but if anyone in the audience has questions, you can line up and we can start getting that going. Isabella, Jocelyn talked about the different kind of types of therapies that are getting studied. So, drugs that would let you maybe eat a gluten-filled diet, and then drugs that would kind of supplement the gluten-free diet. Do you have a preference for what kind of treatment you'd want to see?
I personally think the latter. I know a lot of people imagine a world where they can just eat completely normally again. I actually have gotten very accustomed and really like the gluten-free diet, apart from all the maniac in the back of my mind, like hypervigilating on like every tiny detail. So I would actually, I would be okay continuing to live a gluten-free diet, just not without the additional stress which comes with that.
Jocelyn, do you think that the therapies that are currently in development would meet all of the needs of patients? Like, you see a lot more different people and with different concerns. Do you think the therapies are meeting the needs of patients?
So I think most diseases have multiple treatments because diseases have multiple manifestations, and there's different needs in celiac disease, and that's part of the reason why we have these different treatments. And I think we need to get treatments so that we can know what needs we're meeting, and we can know what needs we're not needing, and what the next treatment needs to be.
That's great. All right, we'll take some questions from the audience.
Hi. So I was diagnosed with celiac disease in 2012 and have been managing it pretty well on the gluten-free diet, and once or twice a year I get glutened by usually eating out, or sometimes I'm just careless. And I get really sick, and it never occurred to me to ask my doctor for an antiemetic.
Right.
So, I'm going to ask my doctor for help me build a little kit for when these things happen, if I can mitigate some of those symptoms. But if that were also an option, I also look at the opportunity to participate in clinical trials, and a lot of them say still symptomatic. And I don't know what that means really, because, I thought it was normal until I got diagnosed with celiac disease, and then I went gluten-free, and then things that I didn't know were symptoms stopped being. So I don't really know. So that's one challenge in trying to know whether or not I would even qualify for a clinical trial. And then the other is the gluten challenge barrier. if somebody said, well, it's going to be a gluten challenge, but we can help you mitigate symptoms if you happen to be in that trial, then that would open the door for me to even consider it. So if anybody here is in the process of developing a clinical trial protocol, just ask more questions from people with celiac disease. What have you seen? What do you do for people like me?
So we certainly are involved in clinical trials and have been dispensing antiemetics for our patients when they get symptomatic. And most of our trials do have some scope for rescue medications for symptoms. I think this is a really this kind of your questions really bring out why developing a drug for celiac disease is different than almost any other condition, because we have a problem where we're taking treated patients who are fairly well treated, not perfectly treated maybe, and now we're trying to give them a drug, but maybe we want to do that so that we can then decrease the treatment they're already on. So it's almost like a treatment substitution trial instead of a treatment switching trial. And so just in terms of like how you think about that, how you design it is very different. And that's part of the reason why we have this nebulous idea of still symptomatic. And I think, compared to other diseases that have been doing clinical trials for decades, we're still figuring that out in celiac disease. And that's part of the reason why we ask you about your symptoms in so many different ways so often.
Thanks.
Well, and I think still symptomatic sometimes differs between trials too. Like one trial's definition
Totally.
of symptomatic is different than another trial's, which can also make things complicated. And I think one thing we tell people a lot, sorry, Alan, is that just because you don't qualify for one trial doesn't mean you might not qualify for a different trial. So even if you get I'm sorry, you don't qualify for this trial, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't keep trying if you're still interested.
Absolutely, and we try and have multiple trials because we know that they're looking for different people.
So I had a follow-up question about the antiemetics, because I've not suggested them for my patients, and no one's ever suggested it for me. And when I get exposed to gluten and I'm vomiting, the feeling I have is my body is talking to me saying, get this stuff out of me, okay? And so if you take an antiemetic and the thing that's triggering you to be sick is still in your stomach and headed for your intestines, is there some notion that might make things worse? I understand that if it's 6 hours, 8 hours later, and you're still feeling nauseous, and people do have protracted symptoms, it makes sense there. But do you advise people, look, as soon as you start feeling nauseous, take the antiemetic, or is there some value in actually vomiting?
So I think that's a great question, and I think vomiting has evolved and it's probably very effective. And so you're right. Usually the patients who are interested in medication are the ones who have multiple episodes of vomiting over hours, and so now it's probably not serving the function it was for the first few episodes.
Okay, thanks.
So there could still be a run on antiemetics from people here.
It's like every other drug. It's the right patient, the right indication. It's not going to be for everybody maybe, but there's going to be some people where that's going to be really important.
Maybe we need to send out a note to all the doctors at Jefferson and Penn that if your celiac disease patients are looking for that, we're what caused that run. Are there any other questions from the audience? If not, I can keep asking questions, but if we have people in the audience who have questions, come on up. So can you talk a little bit more, Jocelyn, about why drug development takes a while and what the different steps are in the clinical trial process and what different types of clinical trials are looking for?
Yes, absolutely. So, and I was actually thinking about this a little bit this morning, how we think about drug development as being somewhat linear, where you have this preclinical phase where you're using your mouse model or your cell model or your organoid model to try and get some idea of how it works. And then you start to go into clinical trials. The first phase is phase 1, and this is kind of, as an investigator, the scariest phase, where you're like, okay, X double-digit number of people have had this medication, we're going to give it to you, and we're going to watch you very closely, and we're going to hope you're fine. It's safety for those first trials, right? Because we're giving things to people for the first time. And what's interesting is that usually those trials are done in healthy volunteers, but often in celiac disease they're done in patients, which means we actually get a little bit of information about the drug that we might not have otherwise get. And then if it's safe, then the next question is, does it work? And that's really step 2. And then step 3 is, okay, what are the specific patients with specific indication this is going to work in? And then once that's proven, then the company can go back to the drug authority and say, this is our data, can you approve this drug for this indication? And then there's another stage, which is post-marketing. So you can report side effects to the FDA of any medication that's marketed. And you also, sometimes the FDA will ask for post-marketing studies, because once more people are taking it, then we may discover things that we didn't in the smaller group.
Great, thank you. Go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me? So I have a 5.5-year-old daughter who was diagnosed in December. So I'm glad to hear that, there are trials going on for children. I guess as a mother, I live in fear constantly of gluten. So it would be really hard for me to, have her join a trial. Excuse me. So I was just wondering, how do you alleviate the fear in parents of introducing gluten during a trial?
So this is a great question, and I think one of the questions that we haven't answered yet. And I think even among adults, the people who participate in trials are very self-selected. So those people who are vomiting don't typically volunteer for trials. But the trial that we're recruiting for, we want people to be no more than minimally symptomatic when they have gluten. And that's totally in the eye of the beholder. So some people may have something that may seem mild, and they're like, that's severe. And others, you're like, oh my goodness. They're like, no, I'm fine. I want to be in the study. And so I think that's why it's about education. It's about understanding, what does gluten do to us? How much do we need? How do we heal? And so we need to know some fundamental things as well, which is why we're doing a study just looking at gluten without a drug. And we know that if you take gluten away, people heal.
Thank you.
That's actually can you talk about why it's important for us to be able to run clinical trials in kids, and why, you can't just say, okay, this worked in an adult, so now we're going to prescribe it to everyone?
Absolutely. So children are very different than adults, metabolically, hormonally, in terms of their body size, in terms of their body composition. And then also the immune system changes as you have more experience in the immune system. And so we really want to know, if we're giving drugs to children for celiac disease, that they've been tested and work in children for celiac disease. And I think this is the tension, because if you look at many diseases, adult trials are easier to recruit for because there's more of them. And they're usually cheaper and they're less complicated, because everything's more complicated in children because you really have two participants, because you have the child and you have the parent. And so most medications get approved in adults before they get approved in children. And so how that priority works is something I think we need to work out. I certainly think that celiac disease is somewhat unique in that we're diagnosing it in children more than adults. And arguably, children have more to gain from a treatment for celiac disease because absorption is more important in children, arguably. And so I think we need to work out how that fits in. And it's really going to be part of the role of the community to advocate for that, I think.
Great, thank you. I'm going to kind of change tacks. Isabella, did you ever talk to your doctor about joining the clinical trial? And has your doctor ever suggested clinical trials to you?
I did talk to my doctor before officially accepting, mostly because I wanted to get their perspective. They'd seen me throughout my celiac disease journey, and try and get a perspective of going back to my question, is this going to be good or bad? How will this impact me for the next several months? And I never felt pressured by my, I would say, equivalent of the primary care doctor here. There were a few doctors when I was getting seen in Spain, specifically when I was relapsing, and they were seeing me as a complex celiac case, that they wanted to look into. But I never felt pressured by anyone at any point.
Okay, thanks. And Jocelyn, I know you run not just clinical trials, but also other research studies where you're looking at things. So is clinical research participation something that you're discussing regularly with your pediatric patients?
Yes, absolutely. I think it comes up in two ways. Sometimes they ask me what's going on. Boston's actually the worst city for traffic in the country, and so there's lots of time to talk on the way to the appointment about what questions you want to ask, and often the patient wants to know, when will I have something better than a gluten-free diet? And then other times, we're approaching the patients and asking them to participate. We routinely approach patients at diagnosis, because that's when we're biopsying patients, and tissue is important for studying some things we can't study any other way. We also do a lot of surveys. And so I think there's many different ways to be engaged in research, and they're all important because they're all going to give us information. And celiac disease, really, we need to learn about it from people who have celiac disease, and ultimately, the experimental models only get us so far.
Great, thank you. Yep, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for this great session. I was diagnosed in 2023, and since then I was considering participating in a clinical trial, but I think for me the biggest hesitation and concern is the safety profile, especially for phase 1 clinical trials. And I want to make sure that there is not at least serious or long-lasting adverse effects, so how can you address this?
So there's a lot of studies that happen in order to show that it's okay to give the drug to humans. So a lot of drugs fail in the preclinical phase because if the mice or rats don't do very well, then they don't usually say, that's okay, we're going to give it to humans and see if they do better. And so even if you're the first human to get a medication, there is safety data, and it's probably in multiple species. It's just not in humans yet. And also, based on that safety data, that's how the dose is decided. So most phase 1 trials, which are those early trials, are so-called multiple ascending dose. So they know what dose they think they need, and then they start with like 1/100th, 1/1000th of that. So that the first people are getting much less than they think is actually going to be what's needed. And then if those people are safe, then they can go to another level. And there's statisticians who figure out how many people do we need for safety and what are the things we need to measure. So there's actually a lot that goes into designing these trials, and often in the very beginning, people are enrolled sequentially. So the first person completes to a certain point before the second person enrolls.
Thank you. And I think we also hear from people who that's their line. Like they just don't want to do phase 1 trials. There was someone at a panel that we did that her husband has just said like, okay, I'm good with you. Gluten makes her really sick and like for a long time. And so he's like, okay, I get that for other trials, but please don't do phase 1. But I do think that there's a lot of safeguards, but I think that is something people worry about, especially in phase 1.
And I think there's worry on both sides, to be honest. And which is why, when we are thinking about participating in trials, we think about our patients, we think about the design, we think about if this is something we're comfortable, if we think there's enough safeguards for our patients, and sometimes we'll ask for more. And so the nice thing is that the number of people you need increases as the phases increase. So usually phase 1 trials are less than 100, less than 50 people. Phase 2 trials, you're looking at dozens to a few hundred people. And then you don't get into the really big trials until phase 3. So the number of people that are getting the drug in a trial, the more people there are, the more safety data there is already. And that is also updated. And so if there's multiple trials going on, then data from one trial might be used, and you will learn about safety data from other trials or your own trial if there's any updates. We will tell you even before the trial's finished.
Great. So if there's no more questions from the audience, then I'll just ask for anything last. Isabella, do you have anything that you'd like to end with?
I would go back to like the education component, just like learn more. I think that's the biggest hurdle that we have to accomplish here. Like some of these questions that we've gotten asked are very good questions and very legitimate questions, and it's very different, at least from personal experience, like reading that on like an FAQ website online than like talking to someone who actually is in front of you, and you can feel the human nature, the emotion in their voice. So I would say that, talk to me or anyone else. There's 2 more ambassadors in the room who are also happy to like share their experience about how we've like interacted. So we're all more than happy to talk.
Great, thanks. And Jocelyn?
And yeah, I think ask questions and be engaged and be involved. And there's different types of studies, different types of trials, and hopefully we can have a big enough and active enough research community that there's something for everybody.
Great, thank you both. And we will break now until 2:20.